This is a video that's meant to be an examination of Curtis Gillespie's piece called Learning to Unlearn. And it's a kind of lecture, I suppose, about the reading, and we could do similar things with the other readings that we're doing for this course. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the major things that are happening in this piece, and I can't cover everything, but I'll try and cover a number of things. Three things I want to foreground at the beginning is that this is a good example of an essay that begins and works towards an implied thesis. That is, the author does not come out and explicitly state the thesis bluntly and directly at the beginning of the essay, because it's a kind of political topic and it's a sensitive topic, and we have to consider the viewpoint that he is writing from and the audience that he is writing to. And so just to outline those now, because I'm not writing an implied thesis, I'm trying to get you to think about the direct thesis, make it explicit, is that he's a white guy writing to a white audience about Indigenous peoples. And so we see the kind of political and historical and racial tensions that come to the forefront right away if we say, you know what, I'm a white guy and I'm going to tell you white people what you should think about Indigenous people. And this creates tension. So this is why he would choose the rhetorical strategy of having an implied thesis. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'll point out some examples of it as I go. That he relies on what we call cliches to some extent, and cliches are sort of commonly understood phrases or statements that people are familiar with, and they're usually quite culturally specific. So an example would be, it takes one to know one, or, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or whatever, these kind of platitudes that people know. And then I'll talk about these as rhetorical strategies and some broader issues of how he's asking us to position ourselves as we move through the argument that he's making, that he is leading us as readers to say, think about this from a different perspective. So I'll just walk through the essay now and point out some important bits. So he begins with the image of the Indian. Okay, so notice that he says he used to call Indigenous people back then. So he's saying, look, even the terms have changed. Back then they were Indians. Now it's Indigenous people. So our thinking and our language does change over time. Okay? And so he talks about this image of the Indigenous person as proud and defiant and sad. And he says, not angrily, but forthrightly. Okay, so to what extent is this trading in stereotypes or truth about who and what Indigenous people are? Are they proud natives, proud Indians? Or is this a stereotype in and of itself? Because he's looking at this picture on his wall saying, what is this? Is this a realistic image of the world? Or is this a construct and a stereotype and a caricature of people? So he's setting the scene for us to think about this. What do we know as white people, say, about Indigenous people? And where does that knowledge come from? How are we to know what is true, what is false, what is accurate, what is inaccurate? And so Gillespie begins questioning his own history as a kid growing up in Alberta. So he doesn't know where this poster came from. He means, directly from his parents. But as readers, we should also think, who published this poster? Was it white people who made this poster? Was it Indigenous people who made this poster? Why would somebody make a poster about Indigenous people and put this phrase on the bottom, you don't know a man until you've walked a mile in his moccasins? Okay, so he's questioning, where does this come from? So he then does an interesting thing, and he says, what would an Indigenous person think about this? And this is one of the important rhetorical moves that he does a number of times. He's like, consider this from the other point of view. He's like, I'm a white kid growing up with this. Now I'm an older person, I'm an adult thinking about this. What would an Indigenous person think about this? Or what would an Indigenous child think about this? So he's asking us to consider other perspectives and other lines of argument. And then he moves a little farther and he says, well, what's my lived experience with Indigenous people? He talks about, I never learned about this in school, okay? How many Indigenous people does he know? Okay, how many Indigenous people do you know? What did you learn in school? And he describes them as historical and cultural artifacts. And we can just look at that language, historical, something in the past, something that's locked in history. That is, it doesn't change with time. So he has this image of the Indian in a headdress. It's locked in history. Okay? Talks about them as cultural artifacts, okay? That somehow Indigenous people are this single cultural entity, that they're all the same, right? And this can work both ways. White people are all the same. And it's like, no, white people aren't all the same. It's like, right, of course, because not all Indigenous people are all the same either. So he's pointing out how, why do we look at one group as culturally monolithic? Oh, Indigenous people are all one way, whereas white people, no, we're all different. He's like, yeah, we gotta stop that kind of thinking. And then talking about them as artifacts, okay? And this is, the language of objectification, that they are objects to be studied historically and academically and at arm's length, that we can look at the object and turn it around and manipulate it and do all these things to it, but we're ultimately objectifying it. And that's dehumanizing, and we need to get out of this line of thinking. So this phrase, historical and cultural artifacts, is very dense in what he's trying to get us to think about. Okay? And he also notes that he was brought up in a liberal and caring household. Okay? And this is important because he's like, I should be, an empathetic and understanding person, I should know better and so forth. But he's like, I'm not, right? And so, this is important because he's not just trying to bash conservatives over the head or, racists over the head or, other people who don't care about these things over the head. He's like, no, I'm bashing myself over the head about this because, look, I was raised in a household that espoused these values of care and attention to history, and even I'm discovering that I don't know what I think I know, right? And he has that moment in the essay where he's like, I'm not nearly as thoughtful and enlightened as I think I am. I have some stuff to learn, and this goes back to the title, right? Learning to unlearn, okay? So he's looking at his own assumed openness to the ideas and leading us to the conclusion, here's the implied thinking, that this in itself is not enough. We can't just say, I care. We actually have to, demonstrate that and act on that belief. And so this is where he kind of makes some of his more abrupt or stark claims when he says, Canada is a white man's country. Okay, when considered from the point of view of his own reflection as a white kid raised in Alberta. He's like, this country is, I was raised white in a white environment, thinking about white people and white issues and stuff. And he says he has to unlearn this. Okay, and this can become, uncomfortable for some people. Now, I don't know, you watching this, what your history is. Maybe you're white, maybe you're Indigenous, maybe you're an immigrant. I have no idea. But Gillespie is taking up this position of interrogating whiteness. And this is an important thing for him to do because often whiteness is not interrogated. It's just left as the default switch, okay? That everything's white and it's never questioned, and we only ever think about minority groups or others as racially othered or, whatever the othering may be, okay? So he's getting us to try and think about whiteness as the default and say, what's wrong with this kind of position? Okay, so this is important to understand about our own thinking processes, about our own capacity to look at our own histories, white or otherwise, that can we critically assess our perspective objectively or from, say, a different perspective, rather than always being the default dominant position if you're white. Okay, but of course you can do this from any position, okay, to say, what is my position and how would other positions see it, okay? And so you could ask yourself, you might be thinking, well, I learned about Indigenous people in school. He maybe didn't in the 70s, but it's different now. Interesting, okay? Yeah, and that's probably true. I have kids in school and they learn about it, but what do they learn about it? Who teaches them? What's the content? Do they actually hear from Indigenous people about history, or do they learn it from their teacher who went through the school system that's largely operated by white people? Okay, and for how long do they learn it? Is it like one unit in grade 6 and then they move on to other stuff, right? Is it something that they learn about every year, or just for a couple of years, or just for 1 year? Okay. And what's the perspective that's being offered?